I built a modern dresser a little while ago, and I wanted it to be unique. So instead of making the drawer faces out of wood or plywood, I actually made them out of OSB, or oriented strand board. OSB is usually used for rough construction, and you rarely see it used in a finished application like a piece of furniture. I really love the look of all the overlapping wood, but the surface is really rough, so I knew I would have to try a different type of finish than I usually use. Coating the OSB with a layer of epoxy resin gave me a really high gloss and perfectly glassy finish. Keep watching to learn how I got OSB shiny and smooth and ready to be turned into furniture. Once the drawer faces were cut to size, the next step was to sand them smooth. You don't really have to use a high grit since the epoxy is going to be coating the surface, but you really want to try to level any rough spots. I used 80 grit sandpaper and an orbital sander to sand both faces and to give all the edges a slight round over. Once the panels were sanded smooth, I removed all the dust using a vacuum and a tack cloth. Next, I flipped the OSB panels over onto their face. Cleaning up the leftover epoxy resin will be much easier if you apply painter's tape to the back side of your panels before you start. Now it's time for the resin. You want to start with what's called a seal coat, especially with a really porous material like OSB. A seal coat traps air bubbles or particles from getting into your flood coat, which is the shiny finish that will come later. Follow the instructions for the particular resin you use. The resin that I used was an epoxy resin, and the ratio was 1:1, 1 part resin, 1 part hardener. For all 8 drawer faces, I used about 1 cup resin and 1 cup hardener. It's really important with an epoxy resin to mix it very, very well. I mixed mine for at least 2 to 3 minutes. Next, I started brushing the resin onto the face of my drawer fronts using an inexpensive chip brush. The seal coat doesn't have to be perfect, but make sure you cover all surfaces, including the edge and sides. Read the instructions to find your manufacturer's recoat time. Mine was about 4 hours. I mixed up a new batch of about 1 quart epoxy and 1 quart hardener. If I was to do it again, I'd probably mix a little bit more resin. It's always good to err on the side of too much instead of not enough. Start pouring the resin over your drawer faces. You don't need to completely flood the surface, but you do need a good amount. Then you can use a plastic scraper or any kind of smooth spreader tool to move the epoxy around the surface. Luckily, at this point, if you don't have enough product, you can pour a little bit more on and smooth it out. You want to make sure there's plenty of resin pouring over the edges to coat the sides. Immediately after pouring all the resin on the faces, you want to use another chip brush to brush the resin smoothly across all the sides. You might actually have to repeat this step a couple of times if the resin keeps dripping. To remove air bubbles and get a perfectly glassy finish, you'll need to use a heat gun or a plumber's torch to heat the surface. I kept my heat gun on low and made sure not to hold it too close to the surface to avoid scorching the resin. And I was able to get rid of all the bubbles really easily. Allow the resin to dry so it's hard enough to handle, but not fully cured. For me, it was about 12 hours. Flip the panels over on a soft surface, like a towel or even your lap, and start removing the tape from the back. Remember, the resin isn't fully cured yet, so it could scratch if you put it on a hard surface. Start removing all the painter's tape from the back side. You might have to use a small tool like a chisel to get some of the tape off. If there's a little bit left over, don't worry, you can use a sander to get rid of that. Use a sanding block or a finish sander with some 220 grit to smooth the back edges, and you're done. Wait until the resin is fully cured and then attach the drawer faces to your dresser. I'll include a link for the full dresser building plans in the description box below. Remember to like and subscribe, and go to pneumaticattic.com for more building plans, tips, and free DIY ideas.